Oh, hey there. Welcome to the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series, where I sit down with folks from different backgrounds and experiences to chat all about things pertaining to nature. My name is Ross, and this podcast is an extension of a passion project I started called Nerdy About Nature, which also includes tons of fun educational videos all over Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and basically everywhere else on the internet. Now, all that I create here serves as a means to inspire, educate, and engage folks with the outdoor world so that we can all become better stewards of it, have a little bit more fun when we're out enjoying it, and work to create a more inclusive, diverse, equitable, and just future for each and every one of us in this world that we all share. Because nature, it sure is pretty neat, and I think we should keep it that way. So come on, let's go get nerdy.
Come and take a nature walk with me. We're gonna check out some really cool trees. We're gonna hang around and talk about all those things in nature that we can't live without. Let's go get nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature, baby. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Come on, let's get nerdy about nature.
What up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Nerd About Nature podcast. I'm your host, Ross, and today we've got a really awesome guest lined up for you. Last summer, I had the incredible honor of sitting down at the Squamish Estuary on a gorgeous, beautiful, hot, sunny day to chat with Leigh Joseph, who is a member of the Squamish First Nation and an ethnobotanist who's currently finishing up her PhD. Leigh does a lot of really incredible work bridging the gaps in knowledge between Indigenous and Western views, while also working to reestablish Indigenous food gardens and cultivate crops as they would have been prior to colonization on her traditional homelands. She's the owner of Skwalwen Botanicals, a skincare brand that creates everything from plants cultivated from the land, the author of a new book called Held by the Land, and she's just an overall lovely and inspiring human who has a lot of really great ideas and perspectives on the world today that I think we all would benefit immensely from learning. So, without any further ado, let's get into it with Leigh Joseph. Welcome to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here. It has been a long time. I know we've been emailing back and forth for close to 2 years, maybe even 3 about this. Whenever I started the podcast, you were like on my list of people to talk to. So we're finally making it happen. Welcome.
Thank you. Yeah, I know it's been a bit of a path to get here, but I'm so happy it's worked out.
Yeah. Would you like to start a little bit by, I guess, just introducing yourself and what it is that you do?
Sure. So I'll just introduce myself in my Squamish Nation or Squamish language.
Please.
Hossqual, Leigh Joseph Queensna, Stewardship, Stopmas East, Squamish Úxwumixw, Úxwumixw, Skwalwen Botanicals. So I just introduced myself. My English name is Leigh Joseph. My ancestral name is Skszwx, and I come from the Stopmas village in Squamish territory. And I'm happy to be here with you today.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
Thank you.
So is learning the Squamish language something relatively new for you?
Yeah, I wouldn't even consider myself a language learner. I started to learn just how to introduce myself in like a basic way when I kind of came back to community through like my work as an ethnobotanist, which I can share a little bit more about. But being able to even say like a handful of words is really like kind of a way of honoring the fact that languages have been so highly impacted, Indigenous languages. And so just even starting to learn some of the language through my work with plants and how to introduce myself has been really meaningful.
Mm-hmm. And so you are an ethnobotanist. You work with plants. Tell me a little bit about that. What exactly do you do nowadays?
Sure. Yeah. So an ethnobotanist is someone who studies the cultural interrelationships between people and plants. And it is a like academic field of study. It's really interdisciplinary. So you can approach the field from lots of different kind of academic backgrounds. When I set out to study this field, I basically I knew that I'd worked for some years in like adventure tourism and kind of some guiding work, and I really loved being outdoors and spending time on the land. But I knew I wanted to go back and study something, and so I went to a free lecture with Dr. Nancy Turner, who's an ethnobotanist in based in BC, but has worked throughout Canada.
She's a bit of a legend.
Yeah, and a really lovely person. And so I went to this lecture, and she was talking about her research and community-based work with Indigenous communities around plant foods and medicines. And I was just completely, I just knew in that moment that was something I wanted to pursue. And so I went back and did a biology and botany degree, and then did my master's with Nancy. And so that path kind of led me home to Squamish because I grew up away from Squamish. So it led me back here to the estuary that we're sitting in to carry out my field work for my master's project, looking at renewing rice root, or chlasm is the Squamish name. Fritillaria campsichensis is the Latin name. So it's a food plant, a root vegetable that's been cultivated in estuaries up and down the coast by Indigenous communities for thousands of years. And a lot of the cultivation practices and access to the plant have been really highly impacted. So anyways, as I was going through my master's, I really realized that there was not a lot of Indigenous literature or a lot of kind of Indigenous voices, as I was trying to study in this field. And I kind of started to unpack a bit more that, the field of ethnobotany has very colonial foundations. When it was founded, it was definitely a very extractive kind of area of study. And so as I was coming back to community and furthering my own kind of education and developing more of a critical lens for the field, I really realized that one of the things I wanted to do was kind of contribute to knowledge renewal, but also really center my community and other Indigenous communities and voices kind of in the process of that. And then when I went on to do my PhD, that was really a main focus, was kind of bringing literature and just an Indigenous perspective into the field. And that has been changing. And there's other voices like Robin Kimmerer and Leanne Simpson did some of her work in the field of ethnobotany. And so just contributing my voice in that way was really important.
Mm-hmm. So much to unpack there in all of everything you just went through. What was your relationship like to Squamish culture growing up?
Yeah, so my dad is Squamish. His parents, my granny was from Snuneymuxw or Nanaimo, and my grandpa was from here, from Squamish. And my mom's ancestry is English and Sephardic Jewish. And so we grew up in Victoria, and primarily we grew up in connection with our Coast Salish side. So we came to visit Squamish a lot. We visited elders in areas around like Wasanich and Lekwungen territory, and up into some areas in the North Island for family and friends that my parents were connected to. And so I always knew that I had this ancestral connection to Squamish, and my dad is a hereditary chief, and so he spent a lot of time growing up, I think, really feeling a bit torn, they'd moved away for various reasons just to get some distance. My dad was trying to overcome his alcoholism, and he did when I was 2, and so kind of moving away and starting our life as a family in Victoria made a lot of sense, but there was always this sort of undertone of a draw and an awareness that there was another home somewhere, and that was Squamish. So I would say that my closest connections growing up really were in the relationships I had with family members, and my great aunt and uncle who lived in Nanaimo along the Nanaimo River. We spent a lot of time with them at their property, and I have just gone back to those memories so often because they're sort of the warmest memories that come to mind of just spending time around a table, preparing a meal and sharing a meal, and just listening to them speak their Indigenous language, and just they're the kindest people. And I just remember, just little details like you do from childhood memories, like the soil just kind of like encrusted in my, great uncle's hands from like pulling carrots from his garden and like helping him in his smokehouse, hanging fish. And all of these memories, I realize now, have really seeded in me what it means to like connect with people in a way that is grounded in like wellness, in connection to place and land, and also plants. Like they had a lot of plant medicines dried on their counter. And so these memories have come back a lot as I've gone and continue, to go through this path. And then when I was a teenager, my great uncle gave me my name, Stíwit. So it comes from our Snuneymuxw or Nanaimo family. And that was also around the time that I learned that he and my great aunt had gone to residential school. And I hadn't learned anything about residential school in my own schooling, because it wasn't talked about at all. And so that was kind of one of the first times for me. And that's also something I've reflected on too, like for two of the kindest, warmest people who I've known in my life, to learn more about what they went through in their residential school experiences, which were really terrible, has also continued to like uphold and support just the ways that I want to honor those people, and I want to honor, those experiences by contributing in a way that, hopefully creates a path for other Indigenous scholars, to follow, or just Indigenous communities also to follow, to connect to this knowledge. And then more broadly, like in the field, to just have that voice and representation in this area of study.
So do you think learning that about your aunt and uncle, like, do you think that in your late teens, did that kind of help shape the way and the things that you wanted to do with the study of plants? Like eventually, like, were you always into plants? Was that like something that you had been into, or seeing that connection with family and everything drawing together, or was that kind of the catalyst for it?
Yeah, I feel like in the process of writing Held by the Land, which is a book I published last year, I started that process really kind of diving into childhood memories. And it was really nice to do that and to remember, spending hours in my front garden, the memories that I shared with my great aunt and uncle in their garden. And there's this theme of, spending time on the land and feeling the most grounded and held in that way. And then I would say that, learning about my great aunt and uncle's residential school experiences, my grandparents' residential school experiences, I think it was years. That was kind of just the start of, this awareness and the start of connecting dots and stories, within things I would witness when I would come back to visit Squamish, like some of the implications and some of the impacts, of intergenerational trauma. But also I would witness the care and love and generosity and laughter and joy. And so I think from a young age, I knew there was complexity there. And it wasn't really until I started, my academic studies, especially in my master's and particularly in my PhD, where I really felt that, I was in this field that I really loved. It was connected to something that holds deep meaning, within me. And as I started to layer in, also working with elders and knowledge holders, that just brought up the same kind of feelings as when I was sitting with elders as a kid, and just like the gift of spending time with people and listening to story and connection. And so all of those things were really wonderful. But I found myself sitting at academic conferences and, noticing the lack of Indigenous voices and people, within the field, and also noticing that there was a lot of emphasis either on, the celebration of wonderful research, which is great, and knowledge renewal, or, the urgency of recording this knowledge. But there was no conversation that I came across of why we're in a state of urgency, why there isn't Indigenous, knowledge holders in the room leading these conversations, that kind of thing. And so during my PhD, I felt it was really important to really further develop my own critical understanding of the impacts of colonization, of systemic racism, and how those intersect, not only with my field, but with how I want to, be critically engaged when I'm writing about this knowledge renewal and when I'm thinking about how I share knowledge of culturally important plants. And so that really helped me to kind of shape the responsibility that I feel and that elders have, shared with me too. Like there's a real responsibility in terms of who do you prioritize, when you're producing information or research, and then how do you present that? And often, there's certain information that needs to stay within community, and there's other information that can be shared more broadly. And so those processes, I think, were really informed by that, ongoing reminder of like these people that I loved that went through so much and fought so hard to carry knowledge forward, and have told me as well, that there's a responsibility with this work. And so to me, that means that as I go through, this work and I publish because I'm a researcher and I'm in academia, I share this knowledge through like entrepreneurial pathways, but there's an ongoing process of, I guess, decision making, based on kind of like cultural ethics and responsibility in teaching, and then also honoring, my relatives and bringing light to the fact that, the level of type 2 diabetes in our Indigenous communities is not a random, kind of occurrence. It's directly connected to how traditional food systems and access to land and healthcare and cultural, healthcare through plant medicines and foods was really targeted, through colonization. And so I think drawing out some of these storylines so that there's deeper understanding, it becomes harder for people to just, it becomes harder for people to be marginalized, because it's so easy when we tell ourselves one story and we blame the people, who are suffering for their suffering. And then we can say that's not our suffering. But when we build out the storylines further and we understand that there's a shared history here, for those who are open to learning, for those who are open to understanding, and identifying things like what privilege, we each carry, how we may be benefiting from, the colonial history here. And in that way, I think having that deeper awareness and education, then decisions can be made for how to, contribute in positive ways, how to contribute to positive change, both, I think for like non-Indigenous communities too, because there's a lot of people, within my academic work and entrepreneurial work that are very interested and follow along, because they're interested in native plants and Indigenous plant knowledge. But I feel like part of that responsibility is also to, just present that in a way that's grounded in that reciprocity and respect and responsibility as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's what I love and find so empowering and brilliant about like folks like your work and Robin Wall-Kimmerer, like, because it's taking it to a next step. Like for the longest time, the idea of Western research and science and study has been almost sterile. It's like you this is the subject and you put it over here and you write down all the physical stats and interconnections and all sorts of stuff, but you don't actually have like a relationship with that individual, whether it be a plant or animal or anything. And for the history of colonization, there have been some brilliant minds over here categorizing plants and studying the botany and everything, but then like the idea of capitalism, this like economic machine, overrules all that, and it just uses it in a way to maximize the amount of economic returns by using whatever it is as a resource, quote unquote. So I think seeing the work that you all are doing is so powerful because it rebuilds that relationship to different individual species and individual plants and individual things. It rebuilds that kind of interconnection that has been lost through the act of colonization, but like capitalism more so. Like, so I think it's like such an incredibly powerful thing to be, a powerful field to be in right now. It's awesome.
Yeah, and I would say, that often when I'm teaching, like introduction to ethnobotany courses, I just go through this, kind of thought exercise of like, if we look outside a window and we see like a standing red cedar tree, and if we think about that as a resource that has economic value and sort of calculate, what that value is, how that can be utilized for our benefit, versus if we sort of shift into like a Squamish mentality of that tree is my relative, and then we look at that tree as a relation, we start to think about what do we consider good relationships in our lives? What are the things that we do to uphold good relationships? Then, that shift from this is something that is below me that has economic value and I can extract it, over to like, this is my relation. Where is the reciprocity? What is my responsibility in upholding this relationship and maintaining, a good relationship? I think that is really central to, to what's missing in terms of so many of the decisions that are made driven by capitalism, driven by, kind of limitless accumulation of wealth, when we collectively, generally speaking as humans, I think have really moved away from the understanding that we're so not just reliant, but, without our natural environments, without our natural systems, we can't hold it all together. And so, kind of finding that balance to going back to, even if it's not, your cultural understanding, finding those relational ways to understand that, we all have those responsibilities, and that, I think there's a lot of evidence, just indicating to that accumulation of wealth is not the answer, and it's not going to work for us.
Right. And I think expanding on that too, it's beyond just like the individual, like personal relationship to it, but understanding it on a generational scale. It's like your kids' relationship to it. And I think a lot of people justify extraction and all sorts of different things because of scarce economic times we find ourselves in, where it's like, oh, I need to be able to afford this so I can, put food on the table for my kids. And it's like, for sure, that's a valid perspective, but at the same time, if in the process of doing that you destroy the future for your kids, then like, what's the point of it? So how do we create a system that, like, I guess, interweaves this reciprocity, this sense of relationship with our surroundings, with our lands, with everything here, into the social fabric of our society,
Yeah, and I think it's a tricky one, to answer, because I think the time scale for how that course is going to change is probably long. I mean, I think during COVID, it was really interesting to, for the world to kind of see on full display what happens when we stay still, when we kind of shut down a little bit. And I'm not saying, there's lots of, challenges and very difficult things during that time, but from an environmental impact standpoint and, a non-human life standpoint, I think there was a really interesting window into just how much our busyness and growth and development impacts non-human life. And so I mean, I would really I think within Indigenous knowledge systems, within the ways that for lack of a better term, natural resources have been managed over thousands of years through Indigenous land and water management systems. There's so much to be learned from those systems. And one of the biggest barriers, I think, is that all of those systems were based around limited extraction, around considering not only next season, but considering, like you say, generations from now. How are we going to tend to this estuary root garden or this camas meadow or this forest garden in a way that's not only going to keep it productive for us year after year, but that our grandchildren are going to be able to manage and, cultivate. And so that's a very different mentality than saying, let's get as much camas as we can get and, get it before anybody else can get it. And then we're going to, build something in this area because it's going to benefit our family. Like those are very different kind of approaches. But I think if we can move, in that direction of considering, just the limitations and balance, especially when it comes to, to natural systems, that's going to be a step in the right direction.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's all going back to the concept, the idea that us humans are no better than anything else. Like we're all just a bunch of animals out here trying to eke by an existence. So it's like recognizing that we're part of these systems rather than separate from it and above it. And I think when we look at the kind of classical perception of conservation and through Western lens, it's very much put a boundary around it, it's off limits to humans, and we let it be, and that's quote unquote wild, and that's this idea of protection, but really it's protecting it from the Western society that's encroaching on it. Where do you think the idea or the concepts of Indigenous stewardship come in to play with the role of conservation nowadays? With humans being active parts of these ecosystems, is that idea of conservation accurate, and how can we update it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that the first thing that comes to mind, and it kind of links to something you said earlier about, Western sciences really necessitating that we remove ourselves, from the systems we're studying. And I think that Robin Wall-Kimmerer writes about that so beautifully in her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, about talking about having a research question based on, the beauty of goldenrod and, asters, I think it was, growing together, and that being sort of met in an academic space as saying that's not what we study, that's not how we look at the environment, it's not about what you like or what you feel drawn to, it's about scientific, questions. And I think that mentality is changing in ways, but I think similarly with conservation, if we rewind and we think about this landscape we're living on right now, or speaking on right now, the amount of from an Indigenous perspective, the amount of immense change and violent land dispossession and forcing people into small percentages of their traditional territories, often into less favorable parts of their traditional territories, and then privatizing land, developing land, draining estuaries for agriculture, all of these activities that have impacted the land and land access, and then to create, say, parks or conservation areas and say you're still not allowed to come in here, you're still not allowed to practice your traditional food and medicine systems, to local Indigenous communities. Often, it overlooks key things like fire management and how that's actually kept, large scale fires at bay. It's overlooked biodiversity, the support of soil health and how that's going to, impact or enhance certain areas, forest restoration. So there's so much practical knowledge, but there's also this history of people being, forcibly removed from land and then contained in really small areas and then told, no, you're not allowed. You don't belong on this landscape. And so conservation has really, generally speaking, I would say, I understand, we see ecosystems impacted, we see loss of natural spaces. Okay. Yeah. The reaction is let's protect this. But by not including, Indigenous knowledge and access and stewardship into that model, it really is a very colonial extension of telling people from their own territories that they don't belong on the land and their knowledge isn't valuable. And so I think there's a huge missed opportunity. And I think this is changing, in some models of co-management, certainly, in areas of Haida-Gwaii and, I'm sure there's other examples of how it is changing, but by integrating, Indigenous stewardship and understanding that ecosystems often traditionally were not untouched. People were really intensively involved and interacting, especially with, certain ecosystems like Garry Oak Meadows or forest gardens that really needed that, prescribed burning and pruning and weeding and tilling to maintain it basically at a certain stage of succession and productivity. And so I think just like expanding, the understanding that there are many things to be learned from Indigenous stewardship, from Indigenous knowledge, and that they can benefit and work towards the same goals is really important. And for me, like, it's so central in my work that I want my impact to be that the people that I've worked with and the communities that I've worked within feel like they belong on the landscape, feel like they are at home there and confident, and that they can find these places to rebuild these connections to the land and plants. And that's a really, that's just a really important thing to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's taking a look at our role within these ecosystems and recognizing that there are multiple sets of values at play. It's like if you have a forest and you're only managing for economic values, it's really easy to justify cutting that down. But as soon as you look at the food values, tourism, recreation, spiritual values, all sorts of different things, biodiversity, then all of a sudden that management plan has to change to account for all the ways that those come into play. And it's easy to talk about forests. I talk about forests quite a bit, but in places like this, like the Squamish Estuary here, has seen so much violent history. Do you want to talk a little bit about the state of the estuary that it's been in and currently is in? Because there's a lot of restoration work that's gone on. I know you do a lot of your harvesting from here.
Yeah. So when I kind of came back to community for the first time during my master's, I had been speaking with community members and asking, what they were interested in learning about. And this estuary root vegetable kept coming up. So Sgsmåsum is commonly called northern rice root, and there's a really closely related species called chocolate lily, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. So people were talking about this plant, chocolate lily, and what I found interesting was that the people I was speaking with, like, only one of them had a memory of seeing this plant when they were a child. So everybody else just had this idea of this plant and this root vegetable that they knew had existed here.
And these are like older people you're talking to. Mm-hmm. So this is decades ago that they saw it.
Yeah, totally. Like one of the main elders I've worked with in community remembers hunting in the estuary with his grandparents and seeing chocolate lily, seeing this plant. And so I was really interested that, people were repeating this plant. And so I started to learn more about estuary root gardens, and I worked a bit in Kinkom Inlet and Squamish territory and learned about them. And then I'd worked in a relatively recently managed, traditionally managed root garden in Kinkom Inlet. And we had been digging up, the three kind of main species and replanting and sort of looking at the bulbs and whatnot. So it was rice root, so Fritillaria campeschensis, springbank clover, and Pacific silverweed. And so when I started to do work and started to try and understand the site history here, because it was a restoration, project, and so I needed to think about all of the questions of what's the history in this site? What are we restoring to? How do we characterize rice root habitat here? I'm kind of using a lot of different names for it, so I'll just go back to the Squamish name, which is Småsum for the rice root. And so during that process, anyways, I looked at old aerial photos, kind of from the 50s before the dike was put in to the river, and so there's a really, really sort of wide braided stream estuary ecosystem. And then in the 70s, because a lot of Squamish is built on a floodplain, there was a huge dike that was put in that redirected the main flow of the river away and often, cut off salmon bearing streams and just really changed the hydrology. And then we've had really impactful industrial development. So the mouth of the Squamish River was dredged for a shipping port. There's a chemical processing plant, a log sort, and a lot of the estuary was drained for cattle agriculture. And so just like these layers of kind of impact in history, and just seeing, again, like the early signs of like, settlers arriving and really forcibly changing the landscape to fit, the needs of settlement. And so, but it's so important to understand that in the case of like restoring a plant food, because due to the like the industrial impacts in history here, there's arsenic in a lot of sites, in the estuary. And so for planting root foods, that's really important to know and test for. But it definitely, having the experience up in Kinkum for a less impacted, much less impacted estuary site, and seeing the size of the roots, the productivity, and how it was still just so blatantly clear in comparison to the site here, where when we did find these plant roots, they were really, really small, especially like the rice root, because it's called rice root because it looks like a bunch of rice grains kind of clumped together around like a central corm, and all of the little rice grains can fall off and vegetatively reproduce. But if they're not dug up, replanted and spread out, then the bulbs grow to be kind of like the size of like a nickel or quarter, and all really, really in tight columns. And so they can't really thrive in that way. Whereas with traditional management, when they're dug up, some of the vegetative bulblets fall into the soil and they each will reproduce vegetatively. And then, the plants are spread out, and the size of the bulbs that I was seeing in Kinkum were like the size of potatoes and apples. So really clearly like a productive food source. So it was just really neat to see, again, like that knowledge and like brilliance in terms of how to be in relationship with a plant like Blossom, how that certain level of engagement, of hands-on work, of thinking, of really understanding like the reproduction of the plant, because it takes about 5 to 7 years to reproduce by seed. So really like managing it in multiple different ways results in just highly productive ecosystems. And so, I think it's just so neat to learn just like the practical knowledge too, when we think about restoration or we think about, land stewardship. And there's just so much embedded within local Indigenous knowledge that can benefit, ecosystems and organizations and people more broadly.
Mm-hmm. It's so funny in a dark humor sort of way to think back on the way that, like, geographically speaking, this is such an incredibly amazing, unique part of the world with, like, you have the Mamquam River and then the whole Squamish and Elaho valleys, like, all kind of converging in this estuary. And estuaries are long known as being the most biodiverse place within, like, a watershed. This is the meeting of the freshwater, the saltwater, it's salmon rearing habitat. You have all sorts of bird species, like, and then to think about how someone from far away from here thought it was a good idea to try to simplify these systems into a way that made them work for their way of thinking, which is just so shallow-minded and not at all open to like acknowledging the fact that they're on the other side of the world. And it's such a shame.
Yeah, it is. And I think, there's kind of early accounts in ethnographies and whatnot of settler people arriving and seeing, what is described as like these Eden-like landscapes, completely untouched and completely wasted,
right.
Because
quote unquote untouched.
Totally, yeah. Without, the sort of, like just the lack of, understanding of the intensive management, that had been happening to maintain these ecosystems, to, increase productivity, to support communities and, celebration and trade and everything. But it didn't look like agriculture in a European sense. And so, it's like this idea of terra nullius, no one's land. When people arrived here in Canada and what's now the US, Terra Nullius was this idea that nobody's using this land. Yeah, there's these people over here, but they're clearly not using it. They don't have the technology or the know-how to really use the land and benefit from it.
This air of superiority that just...
Complete superiority and ego, right? And again, the foundation of elevating ourselves over the landscape, elevating ourselves over Indigenous, like settler communities, over Indigenous knowledge. And so, I think that, like it's kind of mind-blowing how off base it is, and how, and really how like just limited in the understanding so many of our systems of, now of forestry and various industry, are really based in some of these very, small-minded and short-sighted ideas, and often still don't, really see or understand the learnings and teachings that can come, from Indigenous stewardship in terms of, again, kind of finding that balance between, if it's not just limitless, accumulation of wealth, and, it's not just totally not touching an environment, at all, like where's that in between? So much can be kind of learned from systems that have been placed for so long.
Mm-hmm. And I think we're at an interesting time now, like 150, 200 years into colonization on Turtle Island. We're starting to see a lot of these systems fail, quote unquote, when we've utilized this kind of European model of management. We're like, oh my gosh, our forests aren't regenerated like we thought they would. Our salmon stocks aren't, like, everything is kind of on the verge of collapse. And I know that there is a lot of emphasis and energy turning towards Indigenous teachings and Indigenous ways of being from a stewardship perspective on these landscapes. But a lot of times, God, that wind is howling. But a lot of times I feel like it can almost be, like appropriated from Indigenous ways of being. Like you hear like regenerative agriculture, and also it's like finding new ways to name and title this thing that some, white guy put a stamp on and saying, this is the way that we do it better. But it's all derived from these old ways of being that have been lost through colonization, or certainly lost in the Western perspective. How do you feel is the most constructive way that we as a society can go forward in like rebuilding these relationships with the land and methods of stewardship, utilizing that knowledge in a way that doesn't appropriate it or dumb it down or capitalize on it?
Yeah, no, I think it's a huge question, and I think, again, like, to me, it really relies on all the players having, an open mind and heart, and sort of putting ego aside to say, I don't understand, this history. I don't understand how, colonization has impacted my field of work. I don't understand, the Indigenous knowledge connected to it. So I want to learn more. Like, without that openness to learning, it's really hard. And you get people who are taking a very kind of individualistic approach and sort of cherry picking information and techniques and branding them their own, or extracting from, traditional medicines and patenting it. It's like, again, this extension of this, capitalist kind of mentality and bootstrap mentality of like, everybody's got the same, starting point. Everybody's got the same opportunity. If you're not thriving, it's your own fault, and I'm going to step on your shoulders, to elevate myself. Like, that does not work. And so, it works for a very small percentage of people. So, I think it's so important for academics, for businesses, for academic institutions who are wanting to indigenize, who are wanting to incorporate, Indigenous knowledge, to do the work to educate, to understand, and to be able to move into those, partnerships in a respectful and informed way. Because often without that, you get this sort of tokenism, you get more extractive and appropriative, approaches, which do not help relationship building and do not foster trust, and really, quite frankly, just like fuel the fires of anger and frustration. And for Indigenous communities who for so long have been told, like, your knowledge is wrong, your approaches is wrong, or your approaches are wrong. We're here to, to help you and shepherd you like into a better future. And now, then sort of turning back and saying, actually, like, okay, we need some of that information. Like, how did you do that again? Okay, what about this? How can we benefit that? That work needs to be done with care. And it's not that it shouldn't be done, it should be, and there should be space made. But if Indigenous knowledge and knowledge holders are being invited into spaces, then the work does need to be done by that business or that academic institution to make that experience one that can foster meaningful conversations and collaboration, not one that furthers, kind of marginalization and assumes that the institution itself knows better, but they're going to fill out their, diversity, equity, inclusion boxes by talking with someone but not really listening, So I think that there is some places and examples where that's being done really well. But there certainly is a lot of work still to be done to work towards meaningful collaboration. And then the other side of it is that there's a lot of Indigenous communities who are just leading this work on their own and doing this work within their communities, within their traditional territories, whether it be, ecological restoration work, whether it be, management or leading co-management, of, various kind of ecosystems and landscapes. And so I think that often there are models to learn from and that there are people doing this work. So yeah, I think just that educating and approaching, if you're a non-Indigenous organization, approaching it in a way that's informed and respectful is so important.
Yeah, I feel like one of the biggest hiccups in this whole transition is just the time scales. In this Western world, we're so used to thinking on these super short time scales, from 4-year political periods to quarterly sales targets, and every quarter better be profitable or else you're in the red, and it's very, very quick. Whereas a lot of these relationship buildings, like you mentioned, it takes 5 to 7 years for rice root to seed. Like it is a long-term commitment to building these relationships, and I feel like that is the hardest thing for businesses and brands and governments to be able to adapt to like new changes, is because we're so used to having the answers like right now. This new pitch deck comes in and everybody signs on and then it's active in a month or two, and that's not the way it works. I mean, especially when we look at restoration techniques and like implementing Indigenous fire stewardship on landscapes, when like so many of these nations who have this knowledge are in such a limited spot to be able to actually act on anything, to do anything, because of the impacts of colonization. They don't have the resources. Even if you threw every bit of money at them, there's like only so much human energy you can muster up in order to do this stuff. So it's like rebuilding these relationships takes a long time. And in an era of climate change, when we need to act soon, it's a really difficult thing to do.
Yeah, it is. And, again, I kind of I think when it comes to climate change and climate crisis, like I know there's literature and a lot understood about how, hope, like having hope is so important. And so finding those ways, to act, to contribute to a future that you want, with sort of keeping your blinders on and your focus to some degree on, cultivating some sense of hope and, actionable kind of change is really important. But I also think, again, with the example I mentioned about COVID, like that was a really forced shutdown of, transportation. It was a really forced shutdown of like big industry in ways, and development. And so, I think there are like our environments and our like climate events are really forcing our hand. And I think, my hope is that as we my hope is that the change can be faster, that the implementation, that the shift of mentality can be faster. But I know that that's not true across, all levels of society and high level decision making. So, I think I do think that grassroots and community based approaches and advocacy and, action based, whether it be land protecting and land defending, these actions are so meaningful, and they do, hold that hope and create that change. But yeah, like I kind of feel like at certain levels in society, it's almost going to need to be forced. And that's a scary prospect, because it means it gets to a point where you're out of decisions and your systems that are in place are not working. And the things that have been, being said for decades about the direction we're going in have not been listened to. And it's scary, right? It's a challenging and scary time to live in. And to me, it is really, grounded in, like we've said, this kind of early, like colonial and capitalist, and heteropatriarchal approach to sort of the hubris that we have, that we're above everything. And what's being demonstrated over and over again is that is not the case. And in fact, we are so completely reliant on these systems that we're continuing to try to capitalize on. So that needs to change. And there are models for change, and there are people doing this work. And, my hope is that more and more, the teachings and systems of kind of relational understanding can be implemented, anywhere and everywhere that they can be, from Indigenous knowledge systems, in meaningful and, respectful ways. And I think so much of that means that we drop our egos and we take a look at what it truly means, to work together, to learn together. And again, that education piece is important. And all of these processes we're talking about do take time, and they do take an interest in, people sort of taking those steps. But I do feel, changes, just in the work that I'm doing, and the sort of systems and communities that I engage with. And so that does, bring me hope. And on the days when it feels, really overwhelming, thinking about how to make the impact and envision the future, for my grandchildren's grandchildren, and work towards those goals is really what is so important, to kind of focus on and keep me going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's so important to be actively making those little steps towards change, even if they are relatively little in the grand scheme of the world. I mean, with the COVID shutdown, I personally loved that time. That was like, I feel like for so many people, such a needed break from the grind of reality. And then for the people who were addicted to that grind, it was like the end of the world, because all of a sudden they weren't, making the type of money or the figures that they had kind of become attached to in a way that boosted their idea of, living a good, successful life. All of a sudden they were failures in a sense. So, ways to reach that point, I feel like when we are comfortable doing less, because we see that the value is actually in doing more of the things that don't necessarily make money and spending time with family and friends and on the land. Transitioning to that is a really great way to go. It's very slow. I love the work that you're doing, because you're doing, in addition to all of your research and sciencey things that you do, you are an entrepreneur and an author now. Let's talk about Skwalwen a bit. What is Skwalwen exactly? What is the name? And what are you doing to share these teachings, to employ people? It's so much. Go ahead.
Yeah, so the word Skwalwen doesn't have a direct translation to English, but it's a word that kind of means like carrying yourself in a good state of mind and heart. And it's often, like people might say you have like Skwalwens, or, basically like good Skwalwen is meaning that you're moving through the world in a good way. And so I wanted to have like Squamish language represented in the business that I started in 2019. And it's a plant-based skincare and wellness business. And I started it during the same year I started my PhD, really as a creative outlet for the work I was doing, and kind of a side project.
Just slamming it all at the same time, in addition to being a mother.
Yeah. and my kids really were, and continue to be like my motivation. Like when I left my master's, I was like, oh, I've done a lot of book learning about plants, but I really need to get out there and like further my own understanding and relationships. And so when my kids were really young, like I'd put them in their carrier year, and we'd go for walks and see the plants and trails, at different times of the year. And then I started to learn more about what sustainable harvesting looked like across different plant species, and also like parts of plants if you're harvesting, leaf buds or bark or flowers. So with Skwalwen, I started to create products for gifting in communities that I was doing research in. And then I just got really just excited about the product development, the branding piece. I took a branding course. I didn't know what branding was, and I really realized there's such an opportunity for storytelling here and for sharing information in ways that I don't see it being shared, certainly in like the skincare space or even like more broadly in entrepreneurial spaces. And so it became a really kind of direct path to doing things like incorporating Indigenous language and knowledge and storytelling, like in the packaging and branding, and then hiring community members and really centralizing like the give back that we're able to do through we have a Hiam seed project, which we partner with a native plant nursery, Satin Flower Nursery on Vancouver Island. And each year during Indigenous History Month, we'll feature a different native plant seed that is distributed through our sales to Indigenous community partners. And then along with that comes like education and webinars for those partners to learn how to grow this plant. And we work with an Indigenous artist to design the seed packets. And then we also have seasonal releases of ceremony products, which we partner with Indigenous community organizations to donate proceeds from the sales of those products to and highlight the work that they're doing. And so to me, when we talk about like this, Skwalwen is a for-profit business, and it's really interesting to navigate what it means to be, engaging in business, but not centering the bottom line. Like the central kind of goal of Skwalwen is to grow and to accumulate the resources to be able to give back and to be able to increase the learning and kind of messaging and discussion about everything that we're talking about here today. And for me, I think employing women from my community, having these give backs, really thinking about what sustainability means across our supply chain, our packaging, all of those things take a lot of energy, and they're certainly not the cheapest way to navigate, in a business space. But it feels good to me to keep kind of coming back to these, decisions and navigating ways to not just, not share, because that for me doesn't feel like an option, but to share knowledge and to share whether it be products or writing in ways that are shaped by these teachings that have been shared with me by elders and by my own learning, and really driven by the responsibility that I feel to to plants and to natural spaces as well. And so, that's been a really fun and exciting path. That's kind of, it's a bit of a surprise, but it's also a really neat way to share research and broader kind of understandings in a way that accesses people in a whole different very different avenues than academic research and journal articles might.
Right. It's really awesome, I think, too, to see a business that almost kind of operates within a glass ceiling. So many other businesses, if they came into this, would look at it and be like, oh, we have this niche of a marketing, a branding story where we can capitalize on this. We can harvest all this rice root and almost to the detriment of the ecosystem and sell. But when you're trying to account for all these different restrictions, from the time it takes to build these relationships to managing the lands in a healthy, reciprocal way, you are kind of limited by that. And it's really amazing to see businesses kind of adhering to that. And within that, I love your humility too, because this isn't just like a little side project. Like you were on Dragon's Den with it. Like there's investment behind it. Like there's like energy being put into this model, which I think is really inspiring for the future. And I think moving forward in the future, like why do you think it's so important for businesses with this model to be supported, and especially ones that are Indigenous led, woman owned, women employed? Like why is this important for the future?
Yeah. So, I think the reality is that like Indigenous business doesn't really make the charts when we're talking about representation of like funding, of, market share, all these things. And there's lots of reasons for that. I think it's changing quickly. There's more Indigenous entrepreneurs. There's more people recognizing that this is a pathway that can basically that you can create a blueprint for. You can incorporate the things that are important to you in how you build, a business. I just think it's so essential, like we've been talking, to think differently. And yes, like building a business is, this is something I'm like uncomfortable with. It's engaging with, capitalism in the sense that it's a for-profit business. But how do you do that differently? How do you sort of go in the face of like traditional kind of business practices and priorities to not, just focus on profit, to not focus on, I guess to flip it, to focus on creating, meaningful and safe and supportive and well-paid, jobs for people, and doing that, with integrity. I think it's so important for these businesses to be supported, to be highlighted, and also to be learned from. But again, it's like in that meaningful way. Like if a big brand, like you say, like a prime example is White Sage. Like you have brands like, that are carried in places like Sephora, huge beauty retailers that are extracting White Sage and Palo Santo with zero cultural connection. And so, having the understanding that this knowledge and these ingredients can't just be taken and equated with like Indigenous, like honoring Indigenous knowledge or something, that it has to be done in a good way. So I think, Indigenous women-led businesses, every single business that I've encountered is purpose-driven, is giving back, has, social entrepreneurship as part of it. And I think that the more that we support and highlight businesses that are purpose-driven, that are, have that built into like the DNA of the business, it helps to show and demonstrate that there are different ways to do things, and that while you're doing things differently, you can benefit communities and, employees and environment. And it does, like you say, necessitate that you make some decisions not based on cost or bottom line, but you make those decisions because you want to create something that is different and that is longstanding and that can, hopefully have a ripple effect. And so, yeah, I think that it's a really great pathway, for, I would say for Indigenous people to pursue, because it's building your own path and your own kind of systems of navigating, through the world. And yeah.
Quick PSA, because you mentioned it, don't buy White Sage. Is there anything else you would like to warn consumers about purchasing maybe that's been taken advantage of? I
mean, I think just doing some research, there are brands out there that appear to be Indigenous brands but aren't, and there's still a lot of cultural appropriation and practices that don't support Indigenous people or communities. And it's so important, with business, if you're benefiting, already from the like access to land and wealth accumulation that, colonization set out for like settler communities, if you're benefiting from that, and then on top of that, you're sort of, extracting and appropriating imagery or, ingredients or those kinds of things, that's just not a good path to be on, like be aware and do just a little bit of research, in terms of, who owns the brand? Are they doing anything to give back? And I think that there are, like, if there's culturally and spiritually important plant ingredients being incorporated, how are they sourcing those? How are they approaching them? Should they even be, utilizing these? And, I think just, again, it's kind of that opening your mind and having an open heart and mind to learn more. And then you make your decisions. If you're educated further, then at least you're making decisions, fully informed. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that I think for people in doing this research, if you can't find the information, it probably means that it's not being done well. And also, there's so many, I hate to say, things like sustainable is such a bland term these days. It's like, what sort of sustainable? Like, so many logging operations are quote unquote sustainable, but they're destroying biodiversity. And so it's like, it's economically sustainable, but not truly sustainable too. So look into how they're using those terms, and if they're not saying anything, you should probably just assume that it's not being done well.
Yeah, no, totally.
Tell me a little bit about your book. You have a book that came out, was that just last year? Is it just a year ago?
Yeah, just over a year ago. During my doctoral research, it was interrupted by COVID. So my field research, we were going out as a community and harvesting and bringing plant ingredients back and creating recipes, either medicinal or food recipes with these plants. And when that stopped, I was talking with people in community about what they wanted to see, and they really wanted a resource, like a book to bring out on the land. And so I started to work on that. And that's really kind of the origin of where Held by the Land came. And around that same time, I was contacted by a publisher who was interested in just very broadly publishing a book that had connections to Indigenous plants. And so I sort of pitched this idea, spoke with my community first and the people I'd been working with, and then started to write Held by the Land. And I was intimidated at the beginning. I was like, at this point in my career, like, who am I to write an ethnobotany book? But I was thinking about the books that I often resources that I utilize that attempt to collect, a little bit of ethnobotanical information from a wide range of Indigenous communities. And I wasn't comfortable with taking that approach. So I said, okay, like, I'm going to write this book from a Squamish perspective through personal storytelling and relationships and Squamish language, but write it in a way so that other Indigenous communities could pick this up as a blueprint for, like, here's how we just fill in our, plant knowledge, or for non-Indigenous readers can pick it up and learn about this relational, way of moving through ecosystems and building relationships with plants. And so, the process of writing it was really wonderful in the sense that I got to do a deep dive into how is it that I want to really enact these, teachings of responsibility, reciprocity, and respect in writing and sharing this knowledge. And so there was a lot of consultation with other plant knowledge holders and other communities for how to share and what to share. Because in each of the plant profiles, I share a recipe and some of the plant gifts. So some of the, benefits or ways that these plants have been utilized traditionally. And so that took a lot of care. And in some of the, we shared lots of kind of more contemporary recipes, but say for a species like camas, where we don't want people going out and wild harvesting camas because it's, environments have been so highly impacted and percentages are so low for Garry Oak ecosystems where they grow. So instead of doing a recipe, we gave information on how to source and plant camas in your garden. And so just really, it was a really wonderful project. And it's been really neat to see how it's been utilized, from everything from like elementary school into universities or community-based, work within Indigenous communities. And it's been a really positive thing to experience.
Yeah, it's very progressive, forward-thinking, amazing art in there too.
Yes.
Very well illustrated. And so, yeah, great intentions. Could you tell me a little bit about the name of the book? Because I love the story behind the name. I think that's just a really great thing for people to hear.
Yeah, so the name Held by the Land, really, it was grounded in these, again, like these stories and memories of listening to elders talking about, feeling safe, feeling at ease, feeling held, on their landscapes, traveling on their waterways. And really just it translated to me to this idea too, that when I spend time on the land and natural spaces, I feel the most at ease, I feel the most supported and the most like myself. And so this idea of being, held by the land is also really related to this like relational approach that, if we tend to and care for and build relationships with place and consider our non-human relatives and what we can do, to support their environments and to help them thrive, then in turn, like the huge gift that's given to us too is that we are held in these spaces, we're supported, sort of health from like a mental, spiritual, emotional, and physical standpoint. We can be supported and held, by our landscapes, and by the land. And so that was something I think that's just been a theme, and something that really, for me, captures, the beauty of the interaction, and interrelationships, within Indigenous knowledge of place and of plants. It goes beyond plants, of course, but I focus everything I do on plants. But yeah, so that's kind of where that came from. And my hope is that, there's some activities in the book, like land-based visualizations and really just, places that that readers can kind of stop and contemplate, like, how is it that I'm held? What are the landscapes that are important to me? And how can I maybe develop, a practice where I envision these landscapes and it brings me a sense of grounding, and so I think that's a real gift.
Mm-hmm. Where can people go to find out more information on both Skwalwen and the book and all you do?
Yeah, so our website, Skwalwen.com, is a really great place to sort of check out more about the brand. And we carry the book and there's a recent card deck adaptation published this year. So it's sort of pared down information and 44 plant cards. So on one side is kind of the botanical illustration by an Indigenous illustrator, Ocean Highland, and the names and whatnot. And the other side is more condensed kind of information about the plant. And the card deck, I should say, is also the covers designed for the book, and the card deck designed by Sarah Jim, who's an artist, Indigenous artist from Squamish territories. And so you can find out more there. And then Held by the Land is available in lots of independent bookstores, and you can always request to have it brought in. And then it's also available on all the kind of larger sites that carry books.
But people should support their local bookstore first.
Yes.
Kind of wrapping up here. I have two more kind of fun questions for you. But before we do that, this project, Nerdy About Nature, is supported by people on Patreon. And for each podcast episode, I make a donation to the nonprofit of my guest's choice with support from the Patreon supporters. Is there anyone that comes to mind that you would like to give this episode's donation to?
Oh.
And why?
That's a great question. Yeah, I think so. My younger brother is working on some ecological restoration projects on Salt Spring Island, and he and his partner have developed a nonprofit that is really focused on like restoring land and on like land back, as well as creating like a lot of learning opportunities. And so I would love to donate to their organization. And I can't pronounce the name of the organization, but I can send it to you after and you can really? Share it. Yeah.
Okay.
I've got to ask them how to say the word properly because I don't want to.
Okay, fair. Yeah. I'll interject right now with how to do that.
Pepekin Haut, which means blossoming place.
Okay, so the last two kind of wrap-up questions. One fun, one kind of philosophical. One fun, one philosophical. You are a mother to young children, and you're doing all this stuff on the side of that or in tandem with it. What's it like raising your kids knowing that they're having this experience, this awareness, this deep connection to the land, and does that kind of give you hope for a better future?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier, my kids are really central to this whole path and process, and really where I derive so much joy and meaning from in terms of creating experiences and experiencing, these times on the land together with them, and really seeing that they feel comfortable and at ease and connected to natural landscapes. It means so much because, again, I think back to my grandparents' generation and my dad's generation, really, and how there's so much energy going towards surviving, going towards, dealing with the struggles, and intergenerational trauma. And that's not it, right? It's not only that. People are not the sum of their trauma, but when you're really working hard to survive, it's really hard to reconnect to culture, cultural practices and feel like you belong on the land, especially if everywhere you go, there's messaging telling you that you don't belong. And so for my kids to be having a different experience and counter, to the experiences that some of my family have had is really meaningful. And it absolutely gives me hope. It gives me hope because I think when we are, connected to the land, when we understand that there's relationship there, we understand that there's, benefit in the form of feeling held, of feeling connected, then the decision making, I think, that is made, from that place is going to be really different, really different from either a place of feeling like you don't belong and you're invisible on your own landscape, or like, you don't have a responsibility to your natural systems. So yeah, I think the more we can cultivate, those kind of connections it does give me hope for the future.
Last question. I know how incredibly difficult it is as someone who loves plants to pick out. When someone asks you what your one favorite plant is, it's impossible. But if you had to pick a grouping, 2 or 3, maybe, because everything works, there's this interrelationship between everything. If you had to pick out kind of your 3, your kind of cluster of 3 that work together or some sort of fun fact about them, what would they be?
That is a hard question, and I'm just going to go with the first 3 that come to mind. The first plants that really come to mind for me are Chatyaye or Devil's Club, and Skszwx or stinging nettle. The third plant would be Calcae or wild rose, and the first 2, like Devil's Club and stinging nettle, have been, I would say, probably and continue to be my biggest teachers in terms of plants. They're both, often people don't like them because you get stung when you touch stinging nettle. Devil's Club is covered in big thorns. But to me, it's really the plant's kind of representation of the power that they hold, a reminder of, that respect that is required when engaging with them. And they're both such incredible healing plants, as well as, in the case of stinging nettle, such an amazing food plant, and also just have such cool relationships with native butterflies. Both plants, I think, also are 2 that Devil's Club for sure is a plant that shouldn't be harvested unless you have a cultural connection to it, and it can be over harvested quite easily. There's ways to sustainably manage it and, plant out plant parts if you harvest from the plant. But I think it's one that continues to, teach me in the ways of what it looks like to be in respectful relationship with that plant. And so, yeah, I love those plants. And then, wild rose is just one of my, like, it's a plant that just goes right to my heart. You know, it's really grounding. The scent of it is so beautiful. The flavor is so beautiful. The sight of it is so beautiful. And it's just been one that really brings me a lot of peace to think about, and, you know, has wonderful benefits as a food and, you know, topical medicine and medicine. But that's one that I find just really brings a lot of joy and kind of grounding to my heart.
Amazing. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think I'd just like to add that, you know, everything that I do and everything that I hope to do in the future is really grounded in both, like, honoring my ancestors and being a good future ancestor and contributing to future generations in a good way. And that's what really helps me to stay grounded, you know, in this path, and to know that it's the contribution that I want to make is beyond my own personal gain, you know, is really important. And I just mention that because I come back to that time and time again if I have questions or things feel out of balance. And I think for, you know, for other Indigenous entrepreneurs, other Indigenous academics, but also just people who are interested in this topic, I think it's an important thing to listen to, you know, those guidelines and that we each carry for what kinds of contributions we want to make. Is this opportunity the right one for me? You know, how do I navigate this in a way that feels good to me? And really following those ethics is really important. And I think it leads to, you know, just a path where you don't feel like you're alone. And I think often when we really focus on, like, personal gain and guarding our wealth and all this kind of thing, you know, it's a very lonely existence in a lot of ways, you know, in my mind. And so I think if we can step back and we can sort of find those, the sort of North Star and compass, ethical compass within ourselves, it can also lead to more connection. And yeah, I think that's important.
Mm-hmm. Doing it as a community.
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea of being like future ancestors too. That puts it into a perspective that I don't think a lot of people think about.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for spending the time and chatting with me today. Truly, really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hoichoka.
Hoichoka.
So that wraps up today's episode with Leigh Joseph. I really hope you enjoyed it and got a lot out of it. For every episode here, I make a donation to the nonprofit of my guest choice. And today, Leigh has chosen to send hers to Pepekenhout, who lead various restoration efforts and education on Saanich lands and are doing some really incredible work. So you can check them out and learn more about what they do at pepekenhout.com. That is PEPAKENHAUTW.com, and I will throw a link to that in the show notes, as well as links to Skwalwen Botanicals, where you can get Held by the Land and more of Leigh's work. This podcast that you're listening to or watching, as well as all the other videos across social media, the long-form videos on YouTube, the written pieces on Substack, all of it are part of a passion project of mine called Nerdy About Nature. And in keeping with the spirit of the gift economy, I like to give all that I create here away for free, you know, with no paywalls, add-ons, or upgrades, just free gifts of conversation and education about this world that we all share. Because I think that quality science-based education like this should be open and available for everyone to access wherever they come from, no matter what their skin color is, their sex, their gender, religion, whatever. Because the more people have an understanding of these complex, intricate, and amazing issues, then the better they can act in ways that help protect the world we share while shaping it to be better for both us human and non-human people. So if you're enjoying all that I'm doing here and want to help give back and support it so I can continue doing it for even longer, then I would greatly appreciate your support by becoming a paid subscriber either on Patreon at patreon.com/nerdaboutnature or on my brand new fancy Substack at nerdaboutnature.substack.com for as much or as little as you want. Additionally, you can help support this podcast by leaving a comment or review or rating it up, or you can check out all my other channels, whether it be on TikTok, Instagram, Blue Sky, Substack, YouTube, all those social media channels. Now, none of this is possible without you, so thank you so very much for being here, and I'll catch you all next time. This episode of the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series was produced by me, Ross Reed, and made possible with support from individuals like yourself. For ways to support this project and to learn more, check out nerdyaboutnature.com or at nerdyaboutnature on your favorite social platform.